Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to Christ is the Cure. We are beginning our series on Zoroastrianism. And boy, organizing this was a pain. I want to say right out the gate, I did my best to organize this in a way that made sense, but you'll see why, hopefully, I did it the way I did it as we go through, because Zoroastrianism is complex in its history, making it really difficult to cover as a topic as a whole, especially as we're dealing with the claim that we're going to be going through. And I'm not really sure how many episodes this is going to be. I want to break up episodes by their logic more than their timestamp. And so if I find a natural stopping point, then I'm just going to stop it, and then that's going to be a part. Now, I'm hoping the way I organized it will make sense as we go through it. If not, the best course of action may be to actually re-listen to them after we've gone all the way through. But hopefully you understand why I did what I did as we truck along. Before we begin, apologies or enjoy the birds in the background. There's a bunch of birds that like staying in the tree right outside my window. And so if you hear some birds chirping, just think of it as some ambiance to the episode. So why Zoroastrianism? Why have this discussion about a religion that, again, many may not have even heard about? Well, as time has gone on and more is published regarding Zoroastrianism and more goes around the internet, it has taken on this identity as the first monotheistic religion that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam allegedly pulled from and were heavily influenced by. Corduan, in his article, The Date of Zoroaster, Some Apologetic Considerations, published by Presbyterian Covenant Seminary, says, quote, "The notion of Zoroastrian influence on the development of Judaism and Christianity counts pretty much as conventional wisdom. Textbooks in world religions regularly present it as the main reason for occupying ourselves with an otherwise obscure religion," end quote. And so that's basically why we're talking about this. There's this religion that allegedly gave Christianity all these major components that made Christianity what it is today. And how far this idea goes differs between scholarship and TikTok and YouTube discussions. Like YouTube and TikTok, they just blow it out of the water. And scholarship's a little bit more honest with it, but they still assert something to that same degree where Christianity owes itself to Zoroastrianism in several regards. And so this does give us reason to pause and think about it to some degree, because that's a big claim. And so like Corduan says, this is really the only reason to occupy ourselves with, quote, an otherwise obscure religion, end quote. Now, whenever it comes to scholarship, it tends to be more careful in how it pushes the claim of Christianity being a copy or heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism, and often it even leaves its own assertions of influence open by saying things like, well, Zoroastrianism may have influenced and things of that nature, but they're usually arguing that it did, but they leave it open, it gives them that wiggle room. Now, in general, if you go through Google or Bing or whatever and you look up this topic, it's assumed that Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism and Christianity. It's an assumed fact. Now, on TikTok and YouTube, we'll have these claims exaggerated to make it sound like Christianity owes its entire theology from Zoroastrianism and is just a ripoff, and that it wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Zoroastrianism. The fringe extremes, which will not really be addressed in this series, are those that even postulate that most of the Old Testament was actually rewritten because of this influence, or even say that Jesus is just a copycat of Zoroaster, who is the prophet of this religion. That claim, that copycat claim, sometimes gets thrown in with those other ones that we've talked about in the past. Jesus is just a copycat of Horus or Mithra, etc. And we've discussed that ad nauseum, so we don't need to rehash it. But that concept is applied to Zoroaster too, where Jesus is just a copy of Zoroaster. And this is just flatly wrong. Anyone who does any depth of looking, not even depth, anyone who does any shallow looking at Zoroaster and Jesus and the claims of copycat, whenever you look at who they are, what they did, what they claimed, it's bogus. So we're really just going to focus on doctrines related to said copying, such as the doctrine of a Messiah. That's going to be kind of our focus here. So this is all to say, this little introduction bit, that the claims in terms of whether Christianity copies Zoroastrianism is diverse in degree depending on who you're dealing with, as most things are. We talked about this with the Constantine and Nicaea thing. But the doctrines that we are generally told that Christianity or Judaism and then thus Christianity picked up from Zoroastrianism are generally as follows: monotheism, heaven and hell, judgment day, the notion of a Messiah, a savior, a dualism, which is a battle between good and evil, Satan, the virgin birth, the Son of God, the resurrection. And then usually the Magi who visited Christ are sprinkled into the discussion as well. We'll talk about why that doesn't really mean anything later on, but that's also thrown in there into the mix. These claims are disputable historically, which is why we're talking about them. And even according to the scholarship of Zoroastrianism, especially given the time frames of developments in Zoroastrianism and its own diversity, these claims are hard to assert as matter of fact. There's just a lot going on here, and so that's what makes this series kind of messy, honestly. Now, the most significant claim, I think, that is presented nearly universally on this topic is this doctrine of monotheism. It's assumed that Zoroastrianism is the first ancient monotheistic religion that influenced Judaism and then Christianity and thus Islam. This concept was actually presented, or represented rather, by Mary Boyce, a scholar of Zoroastrianism in the 80s, and since then it's been strengthened or assumed. That's not the origin of that idea. We'll get to that down the road. But Mary Boyce is significant if you're looking into Zoroastrianism, along with Jenny Rose. Those are both important writers on Zoroastrianism from a pro-Zoro perspective, which you may hear me call Zoroastrianism Zoro, or even a Zoroaster Zoro, to shorten it up, because saying it over and over again is a pain. I do want to say, as we go through this too, if you are sympathetic to or a adherent of Zoroastrianism, I am trying to present everything as best as I can to be respectful and honest about your position and your beliefs, and so hopefully that reflects in these episodes. But anyway, most literature and scholarship that deals with these claims, primarily concerned with Zoroastrianism being kind of like the basis or the founding principles for Christianity, Judaism, Islam, are concerned with Zoroastrianism's relevance and revitalization and recognition in the world. That's, whenever you read these papers, that's what you get from them. In fact, Levana Lovern, who wrote an article on Zoroastrianism and Christianity standing close to one another, says, quote, "There is ample evidence to show not only an influence of Zoroastrian knowledge on Christianity, but also a colonization of that knowledge by Christianity, as well as a continued post-colonial attitude of denial in the academy, all of which culminates in the suppression of Zoroastrianism and the further distancing of the two religions," end quote. So, I mean, that kind of rhetoric is pretty popular nowadays, but that's really where Zoroastrianism comes from. There's this minority religion and group, because of its ethnic ties, that isn't getting recognition because basically Christianity took over it and then suppresses it. And, quote, "In the end, the question of whether or not Christianity and Zoroastrianism can stand close to each other as they wait may be dependent on Christianity's ability to define the universalism in the move from historic Jesus to Christ in such a ways to the uniqueness of its narrative and eschatology, while at the same time accepting that it is a truth rather than the truth. Scholars such as Armstrong and Smith offer suggestions as to how Christianity might make this move and allow for grafting of the Zoroastrian branch into the ancestral olive tree. Such a graft will allow for Zoroastrianism to be part of the religious family," end quote. And then Jenny Rose, again, I mentioned her earlier, another influential writer on the topic of Zoroastrianism, in her book, Zoroastrianism, An Introduction, says, quote, "As an ancient and important religion, Zoroastrianism deserves a place in any well-rounded educational curriculum." And she points out that Zoroastrianism is officially recognized as one of the 9 major faiths, and yet Zoroastrians find themselves still having to make their case to be recognized as a world religion and having to fight against the idea of being a minority faith. Quote, nowhere is Zoroastrianism classified as a main religion, even in the homelands of Iran and India, where it continues to hold a minority status. It remains, therefore, always other, despite its increased representation in governmentally supported and locally generated interfaith initiatives. End quote. So basically, Zoroastrianisms play a role in these interfaith dialogues, but it's still considered a minority faith, and that's a problem to Jenny Rose. And the focus really stems from the religion's complex relationship with missions, conversion, and other cultural complexities and dwindling numbers that we're really not going to get into here. But the primary focus seems to be on relevance. We need to consider them because they are relevant to us and our faith, namely. Like, we should recognize them. We should thank them, according to some of these writers, because they gave us Christianity, right? Or Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, however they want to frame it. And so our primary focus in this series will be addressing those major areas of so-called influence or copying. This will necessitate discussing Zoroastrianism's history and theology, but my goal here is not a comprehensive discussion of their beliefs, nor even addressing those beliefs aside from potential contrast. What I mean by this is I'm not going to be laying out their beliefs in great detail and then making apologetic against those beliefs, but rather I'm going to be contrasting and comparing their beliefs with Christianity's beliefs to see, well, is this actually a copy or are they different? So my information for this work comes primarily from Zoroastrian sources and scholars. However, the religion is heavily debated on various points, meaning at times there could, and will be disagreements from any Zoroastrians who comes across this series. At times, I will utilize Encyclopedia Iranica to summarize some of these issues because they have great citations, and it helps just kind of move us through all the debates without having to explain all the debates. And when discrepancies arise between Zoroastrianism sources, I will try to represent the prominent views, but even then, my concern is the history as it relates to Christianity more so than the complexity of Zoroastrianism. And so there is some pick and pull here. Before moving on into talking about Zoroastrianism's history, however, I do want to address the concept of copying or religion being the source of another in general. And Corduan actually has, in that original article I quoted, The Date of Zoroaster, some apologetic considerations. He has some helpful principles on this point, which makes sense. Let's just talk about that for a second. So, quote, in order for the claim that one religious culture was the source for the belief or practice in another, the following criteria must obtain, okay? And these are the criteria. 1, there should be some reason to think that similar beliefs could not have arisen in two different cultures. Such a reason could assume the form of such a close resemblance between the two beliefs that its arising twice in different cultures becomes too much of a coincidence or a specific reference in the belief to one culture. Basically, vague similarities in terms or concepts are not sufficient to make the search for influences necessary. In other words, if two cultures have a similar belief, we need a strong reason to think that one copied from the other rather than them coming up with it on their own. Just having a vague similarity isn't enough. There needs to be a close resemblance or a clear reference to the other culture and the other's beliefs. For principle 2, he'll say, quote, the culture that is supposed to be the source of the belief for the second culture must show evidence of having possessed that belief in the way in which it is supposed to have influenced the second culture. And this is going to come up a few times, and it's going to be important for this particular series. But to put that principle in other words, the culture that is supposed to be the source must have actually held the belief in the same way it is said to have influenced the other culture. Principle 3, for the influence to take place, there needs to be sufficient opportunity in terms of time and location. This one's pretty straightforward. There must have been a real chance for one culture to influence the other. They must have had contact with each other at one place or another at the right time, and again, with those other principles in mind, where they actually had the belief that they supposedly gave to the other culture. Principle 4, when the hypothesis of influence becomes specific, there must be good reason to believe that the influence did in fact go one direction and not the other. This one is also going to be important for this series. And in other words, if we claim that one culture influenced another, we need a good reason or good evidence that the influence went that direction instead of going the other way around. To restate it again, instead of assuming Zoroastrianism influenced Christianity, we need to also consider, well, what if it was the other way around and Christianity influenced Zoroastrianism? And point 5, finally, there must be a reason to believe that the recipient culture could not be in some way disposed, no matter how unconsciously, to adopt some beliefs of the originating culture. Conversely, there should not be evidence of intentional resistance to borrow from the originating culture. When all of these criteria are met, influence becomes a strong inference. Well, let me stop right there and rephrase that last point in case you missed it. The last point is the culture that supposedly borrowed the belief must have been open to adopting ideas from the other culture. This point will become important in this series. If there's evidence that they actively resisted other influences or such influences, then the claim of influence is obviously weaker. And so when all these conditions are met, it makes sense to say that one culture influenced the other. In fact, we could say a clear example is how Judaism and Christianity influenced Muhammad and the development of Islam. We have strong evidence even in their writings and in their interactions in time and history to indicate this. Corduan on this particular point will say that a good case in point would be the influence of Judaism and Christianity on the prophet of Islam, Muhammad. There is surely good reason based on Muhammad's lifetimes and teachings to accept the proposition that he learned much from these religions, though one should not minimize the presence of indigenous monotheism in Arabia at the time. In fact, in clear cases such as this one, the establishment of influence is pretty uninteresting and trivial. A much greater concern is the matter in which the prophet adapted the borrowed ideas to his own use. And so point 1 becomes particularly important, especially in circles where claims of influence are reduced to, well, they both performed miracles. Like we see that all the time with these copycat claims. Well, Jesus performed miracles and this guy performed miracles. Well, that's kind of expected from a prophet or even a deity. Like that's normal. That's not enough. It's superficially the same, fundamentally different whenever you get down into who each person was. Or there's this theme of good and bad, of light and darkness. Like those are so universal and too general to just say, well, this one must have come from this culture and was influencing this other culture. It just doesn't make sense. They're too general and universal. So we're looking for specifics where there's this fundamental comparison where it's like, well, those are too close to say that they aren't related somehow. It's also worth pointing out that from a Christian theological standpoint, you have this perspective in Christian theology that other societies having similar theological outworkings or themes is not surprising, since all image bearers know and suppress the truth of the true God when outside of Jesus Christ. And that's seen in Romans 1, right? This incessant need for a deity to begin with, this incessant need to understand what the problem is with humanity and that there needs to be some kind of solution. And obviously how they define the problem and the solutions differ, but those general frameworks are all there, showing there is this universal recognition of some of these ideas that needs to be considered whenever we're talking about something like this. So having similar themes, even on like good versus bad, that's just a general observation that any human at any time could make. It's not really helpful for this. So again, we're going to be looking for specifics. Now, I want to add to this by saying that even using language or terms from one culture or adapting someone else's language or terms to explain another religion or idea that is changing it from its source material cannot lead to the inference that it was influenced by that source material. In various cases, some language seems to be used because it translates or communicates a concept well, even if it has other concepts attached to it, such as Hades being used for the Hebrew word Sheol, despite its Greek connotations of, well, Hades. This doesn't touch on the use of one's language or concepts for the sake of polemics and arguing against another's view. That also happens, where someone will take a word and use it almost ironically because it can be used for that other person's point. In fact, that's one of the gripes a lot of people have with Nicaea and Constantinople. In fact, a lot of the cults do. Like Jehovah's Witnesses will harp on Christians for taking Greek language to explain the Trinity. But what language do these people speak? That has to be factored in. If you're trying to explain something in your language, you don't really have terms, but you see there's a term across the way that could be similar enough that you can bring it in and use it to flesh out what you're trying to say. Like, that makes sense. In fact, we've done it with many things where we just kept Latin words or Greek words or incorporated them into the English language today. But the point being is that just because language is used, which will come up later, doesn't mean that it's transferring over that concept or it's borrowing the whole concept and all of its other underpinnings. It doesn't necessitate that. It's also worth noting that as Christians, we have to recognize that God saw it fit to utilize other practices in his institution, even though other cultures were doing the same things, such as circumcision. Circumcision was not exclusive to Israel, but God used it as a marker of his covenant anyway. Also, baptism is another example. Baptism was practiced in so many cultures and religions, this ritual cleansing, that it wasn't exclusive to Christianity, but it's very significant for Christianity, right? And it's a matter of who you're being baptized into that matters there, which is distinct, because for all those different cultures being baptized, okay, yeah, we share this practice, but who are you being baptized into that was significant? Are you being baptized for Mithra? Are you being baptized into Jesus? Like, that was significant. You can say the same thing about circumcision, really. So with this, we also recognize that because of one's location in time, language, and society, the biblical authors certainly had cultural background and influences on the topics addressed, language used, and customs spoken of. And that's just a matter of fact. Whenever we talk about like John's gospel, and we talked about the Logos, and we talked about Philo's Logos before, I believe we have a whole episode on that. Minimally, there's an article on the website. We talked about that, for example, where there's this Greek term that has all this philosophical idea behind it. But the question is, well, okay, how does John use that word? What does he mean by that? That's what we care about. And if it's different than Philo's, then we contrast it. There might be some similarity, sure. But if they're fundamentally different, then does it really matter? And so, yes, there will be times where the biblical authors are using the cultural background and influences and language in their circumstances to say what they want to say. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they just took theological ideas from another culture, which is really what we're getting at. Whether or not theological ideas were borrowed, not just descriptors or terms specifically, but actual concepts, theology. And then it also must be asked, especially on this particular subject, why is the influence this way, that is Zoroastrianism, to Judaism and Christianity, and not the other? And we're going to return to this because whenever we start talking about the history of Zoroastrianism, it starts getting pretty dubious and debated. So the main question is, does Zoroastrianism deserve the level of credit its adherents are trying to claim, which as an outsider seems to be linked to just the preservation of this small religion more than anything else? Is Zoroastrianism really that important? Do we owe our religion to Zoroastrianism, right? And so this is kind of all the preliminaries, basic principles of how we should evaluate this, what you can expect in the series. We're going to talk about Zoroastrianism's history, and then we're going to talk about its holy books, history, and then we're going to talk about doctrines and compare and contrasting them. And so the timelines are going to be a little bit weird because like in the next one, we're going to talk about the history of Zoroastrianism, where we're going to mention the holy book, but we're not going to talk about the holy book's timeline until after that. And there's a reason for it, and I hope it makes sense to you guys, but you know how it goes sometimes. So like I said at the beginning of this episode, the best course of action, if you don't get how I'm structuring it, maybe to listen to all of it and then go back, which is kind of where that combined edition will come in handy as we get to the end of it, which may end up being pretty long because even this introduction was 23 minutes. So that's what we're looking at, whether or not Christianity or Judaism owes its theology to Zoroastrianism. And I don't know if I mentioned this in the beginning or not, because, you have several takes whenever you're recording stuff like this. But the primary reason for addressing this topic is because it's been requested a lot, and then I finally decided to do it, just like Jesus Calling. So we went into depth on this one a little bit more than Jesus Calling, obviously went into some scholarship. And so hopefully I can make it accessible, and all the while being respectful to those of you who are Zoroastrianism. Hopefully you find that even though I'm talking about how your ideas are debated, you find it to be respectful as I quote people from your camp on this particular issue. I know that Zoroastrianism is getting particularly popular in the West. The problem with the Westerners, or people in the United States in particular, who adopt Eastern ideas, usually it's this shallow understanding that's just kind of, this pop theology of whatever it is they're picking and pulling from. Like the modern day Buddhists aren't really Buddhist. Whenever you start going down to well, what do you believe? Well, that's not really Buddhism. Or they synchronize with other stuff. They just pull it in. and mix and match. It's Build-A-Bear workshop for religion a lot of times. And so there's even a question about whether or not the Western version can even be considered Zoroastrianism to begin with, and then thus can they really claim to have influenced, or should we say, no, we're going to limit it to those actually over in the East and Iran and India who are actually Zoroastrian. So it really interesting history, a lot of interesting culture for sure. I appreciated reading about it. I enjoyed it. It wasn't easy, but hopefully we can get through these next few episodes relatively painlessly. But that's it for this episode. God bless you all, and I'll see you next week.